You have arrived here in this moment not to acquire a new idea, but to remember a truth your spirit has always known, buried beneath the weight of a world you have carried for too long. Together, you and I, we stand at the edge of a silent and profound metamorphosis. This change is not about altering the external landscape, which so frequently tempts us with false promises of belonging, but about a revolution within the inner universe, a reordering of your very essence, a necessary fracture in the old way of being, with the one who feels everything must finally step back, not to flee, but to truly awaken. The path of the empath does not start from a place of power, but from a state of osmosis. Like a sponge immersed in an ocean of unseen feelings, the empath is a reflective being, often not by conscious election, but by an intrinsic design, a sensitive soul whose borders were, from the earliest days, permeable, perhaps the child of storms, of silent tension, of volatile hearts, a child who learned to sense the climate of a room before learning to form sentences, to chart the unseen weather moods, to anticipate danger, to cushion the world's sharp edges with the softness of their own being. This, they were taught, was love. Yet love of this kind becomes a lesion, a silent pact written in the ink of self-erasure. For years, for lifetimes it seems, the empath travels through existence wearing the borrowed skin of others. Their own silhouette is a mystery. They are the reflector, the absorbent one, the mender, the translator of pain, the perpetual forgiver, until something deep within gives way, not with a crash, but with a whisper. An instant arrives when the soul, exhausted from bearing the sorrows of the collective, simply releases its grip. This is a pivot, and it arrives not with trumpets, but with a deep, resonant quiet. The empath detaches. Do not confuse this moment for cynicism. It is not the poison of bitterness that guides this inward turn. It is the murmur of the self, capital S, that finally breaks through the haze of projection and entanglement. The self, in the language of Jung, is a complete psyche, the image of wholeness within, and begins to stir when the ego, worn thin from its martyrdom, surrenders its central role. This emotional stepping back is not a denial of your empathic core. It is its alchemical transformation. It is the moment the mirror rotates to face inward, and the empath witnesses their own reflection, unclouded by the desires of anyone else. In my work, I observe this phenomenon as a kind of spiritual demise and rebirth. Individuals will come speaking of fatigue, yet beneath their words lived a more profound ailment, the sensation of being a stranger to themselves. They were not depleted by living, but by their assigned part in the drama of others. Their life force was invested in 1,000 external accounts, and they came to me trailing invisible filaments, threads woven into their very essence, tethered to lovers, to family, to ghosts and strangers. And as we trace these threads through the landscape of dreams, through symbols and active imagination, we encounter the same central archetype, time and again, the wounded healer. The empath is Chiron, holding the world's anguish yet incapable of tending to their own eternal injury until they cease begging for comprehension from those constitutionally incapable of it. It is a piercing paradox that the most feeling among us are so often pulled toward the most emotionally unreachable. Why? Because the psyche, in its unconscious hunger for completion, seeks to recreate the original hurt. The archetype of the mother, neglectful or consuming, is staged anew in romance. The father, absent or harsh, is projected onto figures of authority or partners who give love in crumbs. And so the empath clings, believing that if they can only be sufficient, gentle enough, compassionate enough, they might finally be cherished without having to sacrifice their very substance. But this is a snare. The soul cannot know liberty until it stops bargaining for its own value. So the detachment commences softly, steadily, and it frightens the outer world. For when the empath ceases to explain, to accommodate, to hope, they become inaccessible to manipulation. They are no longer sustenance for those who feast on kindness. And those who depended on the empath to sustain a fragile peace now find themselves unmoored. This, too, belongs to the transformation. The empath requires no vengeance. Their absence is statement enough. I recall a dream of a woman standing in a great field of mirrors. Each glass showed a face that was not her own, but the faces of all she had carried. She began to break them, one after another, not in fury, but in awakening. And when the last mirror lay in pieces, She turned and saw before her a path not made of glass, but of solid, unreflective earth. That path was her own life. This is a symbolic act of emotional detachment. The shattering of projections, the shedding of borrowed selves, the quiet refusal to play the redeemer. Yet we must not sentimentalize this phase. The unburdening is not simple. It is often misread as coldness, as the end of feeling. But it is, in truth, the dawn of discernment. The empath learns, perhaps for the first time, to distinguish between compassion and self-annihilation. They start to recognize the gap between true presence and ensnarement, between love and duty. And with this comes guilt, the ancestral guilt of not being good. But good is a category of moral domestication, invention of the superego to chain the primal self. What the empath becomes in detachment is not good, but entire, and wholeness necessarily includes a shadow. The shadow, that dreaded repository of all we had denied, awakens during the empath's withdrawal. For decades it has been mute, buried beneath agreeable nods and gentle smiles. Now it rises not to destroy, but to be included. The empath dreams of wildfire, of tempests, of bared teeth. These are not omens of corruption, but signs of psychic equilibrium being restored. The shadow declares, I will not be ignored any longer. I too belong. And in embracing this dark twin, the empath becomes sovereign, not invulnerable, but no longer governed from shadows. Can you sense it now? This shift is more than psychological. It is alchemical. We are speaking here of individuation, the sacred process by which the unconscious is made conscious, by which the scattered fragments of the psyche are reconciled. Emotional detachment is the purifying fire through which the empath must pass, not to become another, but to finally become themselves. In this crucible, they shed the roles assigned by trauma, by blood, by the collective. They become, as I have written, who they are, not who they were instructed to be. Yet for this to occur, something must die, not a person, but an illusion. The illusion that love must cost you everything. The illusion that to be connected is to be consumed. The illusion that your value is measured by your suffering. These are ancient archetypal falsehoods. And when the empath lets them go, they do not become hardened. They become authentic. They walk among others not as saviors, but as souls. They listen without absorbing. They love without losing themselves. They speak without apology, and sometimes they depart without explanation. This is the power of emotional detachment. It is not a wall. It is a gateway. And the empath, who once knew the weight of every unspoken feeling in a room, now chooses what they will carry. They become selective, not from spite, but from wisdom. They become distant, not from fear, but from clarity. They become unavailable, not because they have ceased to care, but because they have finally begun to. When the empath first tastes the separation, it feels like betrayal, not of others, but their own identity. For so long, their sense of self was anchored to being the one who understands, who holds space, who yields. And then, in the stillness of emotional solitude, they hear a voice not heard since childhood, their own, but it is faint, it is fragile, it quivers beneath decades of psychic static. To follow this voice demands courage. To follow it is to abandon the entire matrix of external validation and re-enter the wilderness of the unconscious. It is to become an orphan of the collective psyche. But this is the path of individuation. The turning point, then, is not merely detachment from people. It is detachment from the story. The narrative the empath carried like a sacred text, that their pain must be redemptive, that their goodness would someday be recognized, that loyalty would be repaid. These were fairy tales sown by a culture terrified of solitude, of sovereignty. But the soul does not evolve through reward. It evolves through rupture. And this rupture, though devastating, is holy. It is the tearing of the veil. The moment the archetype of the seeker awakens within the empath's spirit. The seeker does not ask to be understood. The seeker asks for truth. And truth, in its rawest form, is a lonely country. The empath, accustomed to emotional fusion, now stand alone, not because they are unloved, but because they are being called inward. The external bonds that once sustained them begin to wither under the light of consciousness. Friendships forged in shared trauma dissolve. Relationships built on need crumble. The The empath finds themselves gazing into a quiet that once would have terrified them, but now brings solace. It is not emptiness. It is spaciousness. And in this space, something ancient begins to speak. Dreams transform during this passage. The symbols shift. No longer the recurring visions of drowning, of chasing, of bleeding for others. Instead, there are caves and keys, wolves and lanterns. The language of the unconscious alters to mirror the new stage of psychic development. The empath becomes an explorer in their own inner world, uncovering forgotten temples, facing repressed instincts, meeting figures they once banished in the name of being pleasant. One dreams of consuming a cruel former lover. Another dreams of burning down the house of their childhood. These are not nightmares. They are acts of psychic reclamation. The shadow is no longer exiled. It is being integrated. You see, emotional detachment is not the death of empathy. It is its maturation. Immature empathy is compulsive. It gives without question. It hemorrhages without boundaries. Mature empathy is discerning. It hears without taking in. It feels without drowning. It knows when to speak and when to walk away. It is rooted not in guilt, but in crystalline clarity. And this clarity is hard-won. It cannot be taught. It must be lived. It must be earned in the fires of disillusionment. There exists within every empath a moment when the mirror shatters, not because it is struck, but because it no longer serves a purpose. The empath no longer requires reflecting others in order to exist. They begin to desire solitude, not as an escape from pain, but as a sanctuary for self-discovery. They stop apologizing for their distance. They cease performing. They quit explaining. And in this silence, they become magnetic, not to those who would feed on their energy, but to those who recognize the frequency of wholeness. The empath is not seeking a rescuer, nor are they becoming one. They are simply being. I remember a patient who, after years of entanglement, sat across from me and stated, "I no longer care if they think I'm cold." Her eyes were clear. Her body was still. And in that instant, I saw that her soul had returned to her. She had crossed the threshold. She had stopped seeking permission to exist. That is what emotional detachment accomplishes. It returns the empath to their center, not the false center constructed from pleasing people, but the true axis of the self that requires nothing to justify its presence. But let us not be deceived. The world will resist this metamorphosis. Those who benefited from the empath's overfunctioning will object. They will name it selfish. They will call it cruel. But these are projections, defenses against their own unintegrated shadows. The empath must learn to withstand these accusations without faltering, to remain rooted, to stay sovereign. For every accusation is an initiation. Every attempt to induce guilt is an echo of the old wound, now surfacing to be healed. Emotional detachment is a rite of passage. It heralds the end of the empath's unconscious servitude and the beginning of their conscious participation in life. They no longer react. They respond. They no longer chase. They choose. They no longer explain. They embody. This is power. Not the power that dominates, but the power that simply is. The power that remains when all masks are removed. It is quiet. It is vast. It is undisturbed, and it cannot be taken, for it depends on nothing outside the self. In the language of alchemy, we would name this the rubedo, the reddening, the final stage of transformation. After the nigredo of despair, the albedo of insight, the empath arrives at integration. Fire and water reconciled, masculine and feminine energies in balance, the inner and outer no longer at war. It is here, in the sacred union, that the empath truly lives, not for others, not against them, but as themselves. When the empath reaches this stage, something remarkable begins to unfold. The world, once perceived through the lens of guilt and obligation, reveals itself through a new vision, one no longer clouded by the unconscious contract of survival. You begin to see not what others demand of you, but what their energies conceal. This is the birth of true psychic perception, not merely sensing emotions, but reading the archetypal patterns behind behaviors. It is as if you have stepped out of the drama and into the observation deck, finally witnessing the stage for what it is, an endless enactment of unconscious roles. And you, once cast as a redeemer, no longer feel compelled to save. You begin to notice that many you sought to help were not awaiting salvation, but merely waiting to feed. Not consciously, of course. The vampire never sees its own nature, but energetically, you were their source. And now, with your withdrawal, with your detachment, they flail. They accuse. They mourn the part you no longer play. But you do not return, for something wiser has taken root within you, the knowing that your energy is sacred. In this phase, the empath comes to understand what boundaries truly are. Not walls of defense, but rivers of protection. Not punishments, but lit pathways toward authenticity. You learn that no is a complete sentence. You learn that silence is not passive. It is surgical. And you begin to observe the patterns that once trapped you, the allure of the broken bird, the suffering artist, the distant father in a lover's guise. You see the seduction of being needed, the intoxication of being an exception, and you smile not in shame, but in awareness, for the spell is now broken. You are no longer the one who needs to be chosen. You have chosen yourself. You may find the old life dissolving without your effort. Friends who do not grow resent your growth. Family recoils from your clarity. Romantic fixations become unreadable scripts, no longer magnetic. This is not loss. It is release. And though the psyche may grieve, the soul exhales. The architecture of entanglement collapses to make room for the temple of the self. And within this inner sanctuary, you begin to hear a new music, not chaotic, not urgent, but slow, sacred, ancient. It is the voice of the self, calling you back to the dream you were born to dream. Let us return to the realm of dreams, for they are the most faithful guides of the detached empath. You begin to dream differently. A figure walks alone through a symbolic forest, sees a lion on a hill, does not run, but bows. Another climbs a spiral staircase of bone. At the top, a child waits, watching. These dreams are not random. They are soul maps, charted by the unconscious, guiding the empath toward integration. They reveal what is ready to be seen, what is rising from the depths. And most crucially, they confirm that detachment is not isolation. It is preparation. Preparation for what? For union, but not the kind the empath once longed for. Not fusion, not surrender, not the ecstatic dissolution into another's wounds. This union is vertical, not horizontal. It is the marriage of the conscious and the unconscious within, the hieros gamos, the sacred union of inner opposites. When the empath detaches emotionally, they begin to experience the self as a center, not a reaction. They are no longer the moon orbiting others. They become the sun, around which their own life orbits. This is not arrogance. It is alignment. And so the world reacts, for nothing disturbed the collective unconscious more than a soul who no longer needs to be understood. The empath, once addicted to being received, now walks freely without performance. Their detachment is not indifference. It is grace. Their quiet is not withdrawal. It is refinement. They have moved beyond the archetype of the martyr, and now stand within the archetype of the sage. They no longer serve from depletion, but from overflow. They no longer confuse love with suffering. They know what love is now. It is not begging to be seen. It is the radiance of presence itself. There comes an inevitable moment when the empath looks back, not to return, but to witness. They see the version of themselves who still explained, still hoped, still tried, and they do not cringe. They bless that self, for it was through that long night of yearning that the dawn could be born. The emotional detachment was not a betrayal of that self. It was the answer to its deepest prayer. The soul always knew it could not flower while carrying the weight of everyone else's winter. The empath had to walk through the snow alone, barefoot, exiled from the comfort of approval, to find the fire hidden beneath the frost. And now, here you are, perhaps standing at this threshold, perhaps already midway through. You feel different, not harder, but clearer, not colder, but wiser. Tears may still come, but they are no longer the currency of connection. They are rituals of release. You have stopped pleading to be seen. You have started seeing yourself. You have stopped negotiating your worth. You have started naming your needs. And though you still feel profoundly, you no longer bleed unconsciously. This is the miracle of emotional detachment. It does not kill empathy, it sanctifies it. You realize your love is powerful, and therefore must be protected. You no longer cast pearls before those who would trample them. You no longer explain your soul to those who profit from your confusion. You no longer wait for closure from those who benefit from your openness. You have become the closure. You are the answer you awaited. The turning point was not a moment. It was a remembering. A sacred and unsettling silence envelopes the empath after detachment anchors itself in the psyche. It is not the silence of absence, but of expansion. You begin to hear the unspoken, to sense the gap between what is said and what the soul aches to confess. You're no longer hypnotized by performances. You see through masks, not with judgment, but with a clarity so pristine it feels like a kind of grief. For when you detach emotionally, you do not lose connection. You lose illusion. And in that void where illusion lived, reality reveals itself. Fragmented, beautiful, broken, whole. Many ask, but what fills the space of the longing once it is gone? I tell them, nothing fills it, because for the first time, you are not filling a hole. You are becoming whole. The empath who is detached no longer carries the ache of unfinished symphonies, of doors left perpetually ajar. They have learned that longing is not always a compass. Sometimes it is a wound singing. And when the empath stops following that melody, they begin to walk a different path, not paved with echoes, but with the present moment, laid stone by stone under their own feet. Here, individuation crystallizes into lived reality. The empath no longer seeks union through fusion, but through integration. They come to understand that the people they loved most were often mirrors of their own unconscious pain, that the desire to be understood was, at its core, the desire to be seen by themselves. And in this dawning, they weep, not from sorrow, but from recognition. Every abandonment was a mirror. Every rejection was a key. Every heartbreak was an initiation into the self. You may now feel a strange distance from your own past, as if the story you once told of being too sensitive, too much, begins to fade like a dream upon waking. It is not that it was untrue. It is that it is no longer needed. The archetype has shifted. You are no longer the wounded child. You are becoming the inner parent, the inner healer. The psyche builds new scaffolding, not from the reactions of others, but from your own inward gaze. And how potent that gaze becomes once it is no longer turned outward, pleading for reflection, but turned inward, steady and sovereign. Detachment at this stage becomes devotion, not to others, but to the soul's unfolding. You wake without the emotional residue of others' dreams on your skin. You enter a room and feel only your own energy, not as a shell, but as a center. And in this centeredness, you do not become selfish. You become sacred. You walk slower, speak less, feel more, but consciously. You navigate decisions not from fear, but from alignment. You ask not, will they like me? But does this feel like truth? This is the empath after the turning point. Still tender, still deeply feeling, but no longer enslaved to emotion. Emotion becomes an oracle, not a command. You observe your sadness with reverence. You hold your anger as a teacher. You do not suppress, but you no longer obey. The emotions rise and fall like tides, but you remain on the shore. Boundaries are not iron fences. They are gentle coastlines that guide the currents, not trap them. And for the first time, perhaps you feel peace, not the peace of escape, but the peace of presence. There is a dream I often recall. A figure walks into a cathedral carved from the earth. No priests, no books, just light through stone. He kneels not to beg, but to listen. The voice echoing in the chamber is his own, but older, wiser. He asks nothing. The voice offers no answers. There's only resonance. This is a new relationship the empath builds with their inner world. No longer a child screaming into the void for affirmation, but a soul in sacred dialogue with itself. And you begin to see, don't you, that the detachment was never about shutting down. It was about tuning in. You didn't stop feeling. You stopped leaking. You didn't stop caring. You stopped overextending. You didn't grow cold. You became clear. The empath was never meant to be a vessel for every external storm. They were meant to become the calm within their own. And that calm comes not from control, but from surrender. Surrender not to others, but to the self. This is a secret the world misses about those who seem to withdraw. The empath who goes quiet, who no longer explains, is not lost. They are being found. They are walking backward to the labyrinth, retracing the thread they once gave away, winding it back into their own hands. And when they emerge, they are no longer searching for the minotaur of external approval. They are the weavers of their own myth. So what becomes of relationships? They change not by force, but by frequency. You no longer attract those who need your empathy to survive. You attract those who walk in their own wholeness. Interactions become cleaner, simpler, deeper. You no longer decode mixed signals. You do not convince. You do not fix. You meet. And if the energy does not match your truth, you do not fight it. You bless it and continue on. There is no longer fear in solitude, for you are no longer alone. You are with yourself. And the self is never lonely. It is abundant. It is the inner flame that warms your nights and illuminates your days. You begin to trust that this flame is enough, that your light needs no proof, no sail, no dimming for anyone. It simply burns quietly, powerfully, eternally. Now you sense a paradox the mystics know. The closer you come to yourself, the less you need to be close to others. Not because you reject intimacy, but because you no longer fear absence. You do not chase connection as a salve for abandonment. You no longer confuse attention for love. The empath who is detached has undergone a silent exorcism. The spirit of need has left. You are no longer haunted by the same ghosts. Someone ignores you, and you do not spiral. Someone disapproves, and you do not shrink. Someone walks away, and you do not follow. Why? Because you are no longer trying to convince anyone to choose you. You have already chosen yourself. The old self, the one who needed to be needed, has become an ancestor, and you speak to them now with reverence, not identification. Thank you for surviving, you say, but I am no longer who you were trying to become. This shift is not loud. It is not visible to those who read life through reaction, but to those who live from the soul, your energy is unmistakable. You feel different. You do not vibrate with desperation. You do not perform to be palatable. You have become unedited. And in this rawness, you radiate a peace the world cannot decipher. You are no longer part of the game. You have left the field entirely. You are not playing hard to get. You are simply gone from the places where your presence was once exploited. The archetype of the wanderer rises within you. Not the escapee, not the exile, but the one who walks freely, unbound by scripts. You carry yourself like a pilgrim of inner landscapes. You need no maps. You are your own compass. And though you still feel sorrow, deep, clean sorrow at times, it is no longer fused with confusion. It is grief without entanglement. You will notice something miraculous. Your nervous system begins to unwind. The chronic vigilance, the constant emotional scanning, the obsessive inner dialogues, they still, steadily. The body, once addicted to anticipation, learns safety not through others, but through you. And when the body feels safe, the soul can speak, not in fragments, not only in dreams, but in your waking breath, in your creativity, in your quiet mornings, in laughter that now springs from a place unburdened by the need to prove. There will be tests. The psyche does not heal in a straight line. Life will send echoes of the past in new forms. The unavailable lover, the flattering friend, the family call you back to the role of caretaker. But now you see with new eyes. You sense the hook before it catches. You feel the twist in your stomach, and do not override it. You walk away before the cost becomes your wholeness. This, too, is a sacred act. Every time you honor your knowing, you rewire the soul. Every time you say no without apology, you heal an ancestral wound. Every time you choose peace over performance, you alter a karmic pattern. The world may not celebrate you for it, but the soul does. The soul throws open the gates and says, "At last, you're walking home." There is no ceremony for this. No grand rite, no applause. Only the quiet, only the peace. Only the self sitting with you in the dark, saying, "You have returned," and it is enough. There comes a sacred moment when the empath stops asking, "Why didn't they love me?" and begins to ask, Why did I abandon myself trying to be loved? This question opens a gate to the true initiation. For in that moment, the soul retrieves its projection. The outer world is no longer held responsible for the inner fracture. The dream shifts. The myth changes course. The archetype awakens. You are not the wound. You are the one who carries it into the light. Emotional detachment becomes a ritual by which the soul reclaims its essence, not as a reaction, but as a remembering. The detachment is not from love, but from illusion, not from intimacy, but from addiction to approval. The empath begins to walk a different rhythm, no longer choreographed by guilt, but by grace. They move slowly, deliberately. They speak less often, but when they do, it lands like thunder from a clear sky. They do not beg for space. They are the space. They do not demand understanding. They have understood themselves. And in this energy, something profound emerges. Others begin to shift in your presence, not because you seek to change them, but because your being has become coherent. Your aura no longer leaks. Your boundaries are not fences, but frequencies. You draw near what aligns and repel what drains, and it happens without effort. This is energetic authority. The power that flows through those who no longer fear solitude, who no longer trade their authenticity for inclusion. The empath becomes a hermit, the lantern bearer, not isolated, but illuminated. There is no longer hunger in your gaze. There is depth, tenderness, immense compassion, but the need to be needed has dissolved. And with it, the magnetic pull of trauma-bonded connections falls away. You see people more clearly now, not just for who they are, but for the archetypes they animate in your psyche. You see the pursuer, the avoider, the seducer, the martyr, and you no longer fuse your identity with them. You observe, you understand, you release. This is the silent revolution of the empath. No banners, no declarations, just space, spaciousness, sovereignty. And what is sovereignty but the realization that your being is no longer negotiable? A woman once came to me in a dream. She stood covered in mud beside a still lake. She said nothing. She did not ask for help. In her gaze, I saw her entire story. The betrayals, the nights of endless caretaking, the years of emotional exile. But she did not weep. She did not rage. She simply walked into the lake and emerged clean. That was the dream. No drama, no rescue, just a quiet return to self. This is the image I offer you now. The empath, washed not in fire, but in silence. The empath, no longer rescuing, but remembering. Yes, there will be days the old ache returns. Days you wonder if detachment was a mistake. Days someone calls you cold, distant, unloving. But you will breathe. You will remember your detachment is not disconnection. It is devotion to what is real, to what is whole, to what no longer asks you to shrink to belong. You will not explain. You will not beg to be understood. You will let them misunderstand you, and you will remain soft, not be consumed, but to remain human. The turning point is not an event. It is a frequency. You begin to live from a slower rhythm, a deeper resonance. You choose differently, not from fear, but from fidelity to your truth. You stop reaching. You start resting. You stop fixing. You start feeling. And the world becomes quieter, not because it has changed, but because you have stopped tuning into the chaos. Here, you meet the archetype of the wise one, the empath who has moved through chaos, through loss, through longing, and emerged clear, not above others, not beyond emotion, but rooted in the self that does not abandon, the self that does not betray, the self that asks for no proof. It was always there, beneath the noise, beneath the scripts, beneath the pleasing. It waited, and now you have arrived. There's a final layer to this detachment, the layer where you detach not just from people, but from the idea that you must always be healing. You stop pathologizing your experience. You stop dissecting every emotion. You begin to live, to create, to walk, to rest. You realize healing is not the end of pain. It is a beginning of freedom. You are no longer trying to become whole. You are whole. And in your wholeness, you begin to give again, not compulsively, not to be liked, not to be kept, but as a natural overflow of being. And when you give now, it heals not only others, but yourself. There comes a moment when the empath, standing on the other side of detachment, no longer calls it by that name. For what once felt like distance, like self-protection, like a wall, becomes simply being. There is no need to explain why they stop reaching, why they stop orbiting. The transformation has completed its spiral. The turning point was never about becoming someone else. It was always about becoming who they were before the forgetting. You see now that the detachment was sacred. It was the pause between the inhale of over-identification and the exhale of liberation. It was the moment the soul said, I will not offer my lifeblood for a love that cannot hold it. It was not punishment. It was not retreat. It was a rebalancing of energy. The empathic spirit, long inverted and poured outward, had to be called home. And now that it has returned, the inner world blooms. And in this inner garden, something remarkable takes root. Joy. Not the ecstatic joy of approval, but the quiet, stable joy of being. The empath begins to taste the ordinary, the sun on skin, the sound of night rain, the rhythm of their own breath, as extraordinary. Life slows, perception sharpens. The small things become portals into presence. And this, too, is a mark of detachment. You are no longer trying to escape your life. You are inhabiting it. Where once you were the mirror, now you are the flame. You do not reflect others. You radiate. And those who come near either rise in resonance or fade from your field. Not by your judgment, but by the law of energetic truth. You do not teach others how to treat you anymore. You show them by how you treat yourself. You do not control outcomes. You align with what is. You do not chase closure. You are the closing door. And yet, beneath all this strength is a tenderness that has never left. It is pure now, no longer entangled with self-neglect, no longer a tactic to be loved. It is simply your essence. You can sit with another's pain without absorbing it. You can witness suffering without drowning. You can offer truth without apology. You are still the empath, but reborn through fire, through solitude, through silence. This rebirth, though invisible to many, is monumental. It marks the moment your story becomes your offering, not as a wound seeking attention, but as a light illuminating the way. You begin to attract those who speak your language, souls who do not need rescuing, but companionship. You find intimacy not through merging, but through mutual witnessing. You find love not in its conditional disguise, but in its true form, freedom. Perhaps now, as you listen, you feel this truth in your body, a loosening in the chest, a deep breath released, a subtle yes rising from the marrow. For you have known this journey not in words, but in your own becoming. You have been the empath, the mirror, the silent bearer. And now you are becoming the guide, the witness, the whole one, not by abandoning your sensitivity, but by sanctifying it. And I tell you now with the deepest conviction, you were never too much. You were carrying too many versions of yourself to survive. The detachment you feared was not your death. It was your return. The turning point was not the loss. It was a remembering. And the you that has emerged, that version is untouchable. Not because it is armored, but because it is anchored. The world may still not understand you. Let it. The ones who see with soul will. You no longer speak to be understood. You speak to express truth. You no longer open your heart to be received. You open it because it is your nature. You no longer ask who will stay. You stay with yourself. And that is enough. So let the final silence fall now, not as an ending, but as an arrival. You are home. You are whole. And from this place, the empath becomes a sage. The journey continues. The turning point was only the beginning.